Hi everyone. We need to talk today about some death and destruction during the late Middle Ages. Now, before we get to the Black Death, or mass sickness that will strike Europe in the middle of the 14th century, we need to talk about population pressures. What we've seen by the late Middle Ages is a dying down of internal warfare. It does still flare from time to time, but the Viking invasions are long since over. We have improvements in agriculture, such as the three-field system or the crop rotation system. This means that the higher agricultural yields can support a growing population. So we see, as you can see from the chart here, that Europe's population will rise dramatically from the 10th to the mid-12th century, for example. Europe's population alone increased by 300% to perhaps as many as 80 million people. And so while there was plenty enough food to go around, at least in the short term, we're going to see a slight climate hiccup in the late 13th century. In the 1290s, for instance, we will start to see Europe becoming slightly colder and wetter because of a global cooling event. When that happens, crops don't get in time and they're killed in the field before harvest. This is going to create famine in certain areas. And this famine was bad enough. There were, historians estimate, in some areas perhaps as many as 10 to 25% of inhabitants in these regions may have perished simply from hunger. And so I say all this before we get to the outbreak of the Black Death, because when this sickness does appear, you have a bunch of people who've been suffering from chronic malnutrition for some time now. And what malnutrition does is it wrecks your immune system. You do not have the nutrients to fight off infection. Another reason why, when this sickness appears, it is so incredibly devastating is the fact that you've had so many people moving to urban areas by the early 14th century, seeking employment, a different type of life, what have you. There were no building codes back then. There was virtually no sanitation in some of these cities. It's disgusting what they do with human waste. They essentially throw it out the window into the street. But you also have the fact that people are living on top of one another, right? You've got people crowded into very, very small spaces. So that, again, when this illness is first introduced into the continent and it comes into some of these overcrowded, burdened areas, it's just simply going to spread like wildfire. And so now to the sickness itself. It's often referred to as the Black Death or sometimes the Black Plague because of the huge sort of black swellings that would appear on people's necks, underneath their armpits, in their groin area. For example, when the plague was first noticed, the first victims of the plague were on board several trading ships that had just returned from the Far East, specifically China. They had pulled into port in the harbor of Messina on the island of Sicily in October of 1347. And when these Italian trading ships returned back from the Far East, they contained rather strange cargo. They were filled with dead and dying sailors who had these huge egg-shaped black swellings, like I said, on their neck, and in certain areas that we know now have lymph nodes in them, your armpits, your groin area. And what was so baffling to physicians is that when they pressed upon these peculiar black swellings, they oozed pus, and that the victims seemed to be in extreme pain, and victims died very, very quickly. And in fact, the Black Death spread very quickly and killed off perhaps as much as 30% of Europe's population within just several years' worth of time. It is also sometimes referred to as the Bubonic Plague. Those big swellings were referred to as buboes. And what was so strange to many of these doctors, they'd never seen anything like this before, is they didn't know how victims became infected, so they therefore didn't know how to stop the spread of this sickness. They also were baffled at how quickly people might die of this particular sickness. For instance, a person could go to sleep at night feeling fine but be dead in the morning if they had been exposed to this illness. Or, strangely enough, you might have doctors who had ministered to multiple patients who had been exposed to the sickness, who might start developing symptoms themselves. It might take 3 or 4 days for them to die. It just seems so random, the timeline. But of those who got sick, sometimes they dropped off very, very quickly. As the Italian writer Boccaccio noted, victims of this strange sickness often, quote, ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors in paradise. That was how rapidly they might die. The mortality rate for the bubonic form of plague was 50 to 60%. So that's a toss of the coin whether or not you will survive this infection. And we know that the vector for this disease, what was carrying it from person to person, were fleas. The umble flea. And you might say, well, Miss Ward, people had fleas on them back then? Yes, they did. Europeans were disgusting during this time period, okay? They bathed maybe once or twice a year, believing, according to folk custom, that bathing actually made you more susceptible to sickness. And we're talking about kings and queens as well as average people walking around. They're picking fleas off of them every day. They don't think anything about fleas. So the thing is that fleas carry this bacteria. This is a bacterial infection that causes the bubonic plague. They carry the bacteria in their gut. It doesn't kill the flea, but when the flea bites a victim, a rat, a dog, a human, what have you, they regurgitate some of that bacteria from their gut, and some of it goes into their new victim. All right, so fleas are normally on non-humans, right, on rats. So the reason why I have a picture of rats here is that the fleas often fed on rats. Rats will die of this bacterial infection. So when a rat would become infected, it would die. When the rat would die, the flea would simply hop off to a new host. That might be another rat, or as I said, a cattle, a sheep, a human, what have you. All right, so this is how the initial outbreak begins, is a blood-borne form of this bacterial infection. And everyone was used to seeing rats as well as fleas on a day-to-day basis. No one made the connection at that time between the piles of dead rats that would appear in cities and the outbreak of sickness just hours, if not days afterwards. These were all commonplace sights, and they did not have the benefit of our advanced medical knowledge during this time. So they had no way of stopping the sickness. So as you can see, the sickness will run very quickly through Europe over a very, very quick period of time. More ominously, too, it's kind of difficult to get the blood-borne form of this bacteria, but it will morph over time. Mother Nature always finds a way, right, through evolution. So what will happen is the blood-borne form of this sickness will morph into an airborne form, the pneumonic plague. So now all it takes is someone sneezing around you, coughing, someone breathing around you, and you might become infected. For the pneumonic, the airborne form of this sickness, those who caught it had a 90 to 100% mortality rate. Now it's not just a flip of the coin, it's you're going to die if you get the airborne form of the sickness. So you can see how in many of these overcrowded urban areas it is just running crazy, rampant. Not a day went by when someone's mother, brother, cousin wasn't dying of this disease. And so you can imagine people are searching for answers. They'd love to know how it's spreading. They really want to know what caused it to begin with. And again, for these folks, they don't have any kind of specialized medical training. So they will rely upon, they'll come up with some pretty crazy ideas, actually, about to come up for the reason for all the death and destruction around them. Some of them blamed an earthquake that occurred. They said the ground, ripped open and it released poisonous vapors. Others looked to the heavens and noted that before the plague's outbreak, several planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, were aligned briefly for a period of time. They said that's it. That somehow threw off the universe. More ominously, some people began to blame Jewish residents in Europe. Non-Christians, and say they were the ones that did it. They're pagans. They don't believe in Christianity. Perhaps what they did was they poisoned the wells, and that they're trying to kill off the Christians. This, of course, not true. But what it resulted in is the rounding up and executing of large numbers of innocent Jews throughout Europe during this period. Another, probably the most commonly accepted reason for all of the chaos and destruction around them was people said, God is displeased with us. They came to believe that this was punishment for their collective sins over time. They reasoned that only God, all-powerful, an all-powerful deity, could create such a savage, far-reaching sickness, and that it was their adultery or blasphemy or heresy, whatever they had done, that this was God showing them that they must pay for their sins. And interestingly enough, the Pope agreed, the head of the Roman Catholic Church. In September of 1348, the Pope, in a papal edict, specifically referred to, quote, this pestilence with which God is affecting the Christian people. All right, so imagine that in addition to survivor's guilt, what we call today, those people who maybe didn't die while everyone else around them did, imagine on top of survivor's guilt another layer of, well, I did this because I cheated on my taxes last year. Or I must have done this, because I stole a chicken from my neighbor's yard. Just imagine the crushing psychological trauma that these people endured. For some folks, they're in the streets weeping, pulling out their hair in agony, seeing the people they love die a painful death. For others, so-called dancing mania broke out in some villages as people began to take to the streets drunk. Just saying, I don't know how much longer I have to live, so I'm just going to stay drunk and enjoy my final few hours eating and drinking and carousing. So we're going to see that this affects everything about European society. How can it not? When in a period of 3 years, 1 out of every 3 people is dead. They're having trouble burying the dead, all right, because so many people are dying so very quickly. To give you an idea, at the height of the plague's outbreak, 800 people were dropping dead every day in Paris, and that's day after day, week after week, month after month. 500 were dying every day in the city of Pisa, in the Italian city-states. They can't keep up with it. So eventually they start realizing we can't give them all Christian burials. We'll pile the bodies up and we'll set fire to them. Because while they may not have understood germ theory or bacteria, they knew it was not good to have a bunch of dead, rotting corpses lying around. All right, and so this affects everything about European society. What do you do if your boss is dead? Do you go to work? Well, do you need money now? More pressing issues is where do I find fresh water? Where do I find food? For those people who lived in cities, they were not farmers. So this affects everything. Everything starts to kind of break down. And what it also creates is a massive labor shortage in Europe. All right, when you have this many people dying so quickly, you're going to have a labor shortage. And what this will translate into is a number of peasant rebellions that will break out in the wake of this sickness. Among the peasantry, those who work arguably the hardest and get the least amount of pay, they're going to start using this as an opportunity to start pressing the lord of the manor for wages for the first time, or for a release from their tax debts or the fees that they have to pay. They're going to start looking around and saying, you know what, you need us more than we need you. All right, so if you want me to stay here and work your land, you better start coming up with a more comfortable arrangement here. All right, so lots of peasant rebellions. Unfortunately, some of them will turn very, very violent. This will only add to the chaos and death and destruction over time. A very unique peasant rebellion that breaks out will be in England. John Ball, an English minister, will start to argue that not only did peasants need wages, but perhaps they also needed some political recognition. Now, this rebellion will be savagely put down by the English monarchy, but it will at least introduce the idea for the very first time in England that perhaps the peasantry deserved a political voice for the first time. The 100 Years' War, here's more devastation added in to that visited by the Black Death, an ongoing war between France and England during this period. England will dominate for the majority of the war, using weapons such as the longbow. And what we're going to see is that Joan of Arc will come to be a very powerful symbol that will help rally the French army so that the tide will turn. Ultimately, England will lose the 100 Years' War, and as part of this process, I'll go back one slide, they're going to lose their territorial holdings on the continent of Europe and will force to be an island nation from this point forward.